He said, "Son, I just wish you could have seen me back then. I wish you could have seen me on that horse." I wish to tell you now one of their stories, and I think it's going to help you see why my book had to be written, and it's a very specific story of myth and reality and how they can so easily merge. I had heard about Kenneth Goodeagle long ago when I was laboring on my book and riding out across the land in search of the truth. And I finally found Mr. Goodeagle and contacted him. And he gave me permission to come to his home not far from the town of Pawnee, Oklahoma. And I went there with my wife, Suzanne. And we were armed with tape recorders, tapes, notebooks, camera, and film. Our minds were open, and we grew more and more excited as we drove from Tulsa to Pawnee. We went through the town, past the courthouse and the Pawnee Grill and Masonic Drive-In, followed the simple directions out to the Goodeagle place. We crossed Black Bear Creek and Pepper Creek, drove down some dusty lanes and section roads lined with high Johnson grass, and we pulled up at this modest frame house snug against a clump of sassafras trees not far from the Frisco Railroad tracks, and nearby a pasture where spotted ponies grazed. A mama dog and fresh pups greeted us, and we went inside just as a gentle voice told us to do. And when our eyes adjusted to the darkness, we saw an old woman, Opal Goodeagle, standing bent and crooked at her aluminum walker. And beside her in an old easy chair was her husband of many years, Kenneth. And with the help of a stout cane, he rose to greet us, and we shook hands. And as we made the customary small talk about the weather and our trip and the good directions he provided us, I took in that room in a glance, and I saw that this was the Goodeagles' world. Opal had her place on the couch, and I could tell that Kenneth spent most of his time in that easy chair. And next to it was a table with a water glass and pills and old letters, old men things, and some tools that Kenneth explained he used at the nearby bench where he made Indian rattles. He said he did this piecework to earn money for groceries and a living. And a white man came by once in a while and picked up a box of rattles, and he paid Kenneth a little something and then took the rattles and sold them for quite a bit more to tourists and folks who really wanted to own something made by a genuine Indian. And so we pulled up kitchen chairs and sat with the Goodeagles, and we spent that afternoon talking to Kenneth about his life and times when he was a youngster and rode the range and traveled the nation and the world as an entertainer for Pawnee Bill Lilly and for the Miller's 101 Ranch. Kenneth Goodeagle, half Quapaw, half Pawnee, didn't have much formal education, but went to work on ranches when he was a kid. By the time he was 15, he started in on the Wild West circuit. And the young daredevil got to know Pawnee Bill, and he bought a sweet paint pony from the old showman. And Kenneth taught that paint pony to do tricks, to lie down and sit up and kneel. And that little paint was smart and fast, and together he and the young Indian boy made a good team. Kenneth had met a Quapaw girl he liked very much, and her name was Betty. And that was the name he gave to his trick horse, Betty. Kenneth went to work for old Pawnee Bill. Worked for him a long time, and Pawnee Bill even wanted to adopt the young man, but Kenneth's father would not give his permission. Kenneth did stay close to Lily, and he called Pawnee Bill Dad, and Pawnee Bill called Kenneth son. and Goodeagle recalled for us those wild evenings at the Lily's Blue Hawk Peak home. He remembered May Lily, the rifle queen, the princess of the prairie, drinking too much, and how young Kenneth had the chore of cutting her out of her corset and helping put the lady sharpshooter to bed. He recalled visits from a young Will Rogers and the Miller brothers and Tom Mix and an aging Buffalo Bill Cody. He told of riding with Jose Mexican Joe Barrera, a favorite performer for Lily and the Miller boys, and of watching Bill Picket bulldog like no one else alive on that sprawling 101. After a time, Kenneth stopped and retrieved a box with some papers he wanted us to see, and inside were yellowed newspaper clippings and magazine stories about the old days on the Wild West Trail, and fished out a letter from Pawnee Bill and told us a lot. He said, Mr. Kenneth Goodeagle is a good horse and steer rider, a good rodeo boy, and he's willing to do anything he can to put the performance over. Wrote Pawnee Bill. And then we found his old passport. Kenneth Goodeagle, 5'5" tall, American Indian, occupation cowboy with rodeo show. And that passport was stamped with Spain and Mexico and Argentina and England. And Kenneth told us he could remember clear as yesterday, riding into the arena in London, surrounded by fancy ladies and gents in their silk cravats who came to see the big Wild West shows. And Kenneth rode into that tan-bark arena bareback on Speedy Betty, his fine paint trick horse. All Kenneth wore was a breechcloth, moccasins, and an eagle war bonnet that cascaded down his back, and he grabbed handfuls of Betty's mane and tore around the ring, shouting like a banshee. And those elegant folks in the stand screamed, and their eyes got big as pie plates. And afterwards, some of them came up to Kenneth, and they were timid, and they seemed faint-hearted and fearful. And they asked him, "Are you a real Indian?" And Kenneth looked him in the eye and told him proudly, "Yes, I am. I am a real wild Indian." And the people shrieked, and they ran away. I asked Kenneth if we could make some pictures of him, and he said that would be just fine. But first, he wanted to be properly dressed. He was, after all, still a showman. So we went to his bedroom, and when he came back, he had on trousers tucked into the tops of his leather boots, and he wore a bright ribbon shirt and a cowboy hat. He apologized because it was made of straw, not a proper felt hat, and we told him that was just fine. We went outside, and he stood with his cane under some shade trees, and he smiled right into the lens. And when I asked him if we could carry him up to Pawnee Bill's old home, he said that was a good plan. So we drove to that big house on Blue Hawk Peak, and Kenneth showed us all around. More stories. A flood of memories poured from Kenneth Goodeagle that afternoon. And the more we talked, and the more he remembered, the stronger he became. He had seemed like a tired old man when we first found him that morning, but now his eyes had become bright and shining. And he was 18 years old once again. And on the move was Zach Miller and Mix and Picket and Mexican Joe. And when we drove back to his house, Kenneth talked of riding with the 101 show in its last sad days. And finally he spoke of the time when a trailer hitch broke in a road accident and the trailer flipped over and his trick paint named Betty died. Kenneth stopped riding like a real wild Indian. He quit the show per circuit, he quit bronc busting, bull riding, gave up that life he knew. He gave his spurs to his kids and went to work in the oil patch. And he held up his hands and showed us that 3 fingers were missing, sliced off by some dropped oil field pipe. And back at his house with Opal, Kenneth hung up the ribbon shirt and pulled off those shiny boots. And he fell right back down into that soft chair, and his eyes started looking old again. He just gazed out the window at those spotted ponies off in the meadow. So I bought a rattle from him, and I shook his hand once more. And then as we were leaving, Kenneth reached out and took hold of my arm. And he said, "Son, I just wish you could have seen me back then. I wish you could have seen me on that horse." And I looked down at Kenneth, a link to one of the most colorful chapters of the history of the land. And I told him straight out, "But Kenneth, we did see you on that horse. You were on Betty all day today. We saw you, we truly did." And Kenneth smiled again, and we left. And we drove back to Tulsa all the way home. Neither of us spoke a word.